Okay, good morning. It's 11 o'clock. We're going to get started here. And my name is Evan Weiner, and I've been doing a lot of talks on the 1920s lately, and people who have been in the audience lately have had a good time with it because they talk about their parents and the stories that their parents or their grandparents told them in the 1930s and the 1940s about their childhood and growing up. And this guy, Warren G. Harding, he was president of the United States from March 4th, 1921 to August 2nd, 1923, when he collapsed and died in San Francisco. And he is rated as one of the worst presidents ever, but I have a bone to pick with that, and I'll explain that to you in a couple of minutes. But anyway, Harding dies, Calvin Coolidge becomes the President of the United States. Harding dies suddenly of a stroke about 7:30 in the evening in San Francisco on August the 2nd. Oh, child labor. There was child labor in the United States in 1923. Germany, hyperinflation, and that kind of brings Adolf Hitler to the forefront. The flappers. And I've heard stories the last couple of days from women who talked to their mothers, and their mothers were flappers in the 1920s, and they danced on tabletops at speakeasies, and they smoked, and they wore high heels, and they cursed, and their mothers and grandmothers and older sisters were worried about what's happening to her. And they get some good stories, particularly from one woman who was telling me that her mother was a good Catholic but danced on tables at speakeasies. The Charleston, in fact, she said that her mother taught her how to dance the Charleston, and there's the Charleston. Organized crime and prohibition, that was a big, big deal in those days. And how many of you like horror movies? No. Nobody liked Lon Chaney? Nobody liked Boris Karloff? Well, the genre really starts with this one, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, back in 1923. And radio is becoming more accessible. And that's me back in 1979, interviewing Jack Kemp, who was running for president. That was in Spark Hill, New York. I knew Kemp for about 30 years as well. And unfortunately today, a 23-year-old is not going to get the opportunity to interview presidential candidates like I did. I interviewed him, I interviewed Ronald Reagan, I interviewed Ted Kennedy. Excuse me?
What was your profession?
I was in radio. I was a news person in radio, and I was on WNEW. Remember WNEW?
Yes.
Quick story about that. In March of 1978, late March 1978, I was assigned to cover a Democratic fundraiser in Rockland County, and John Lindsay walked in, told me he was running for the Senate, 1980 in New York. WNEW called me, and it was Henry Marcotte. He said, "We'd like you to do that story." I said, "How much are you going to pay me?" He said, $10. I said, "Sold." And I did news for WNEW 78, 79, 80, and 81 for over a 4-year period. And television, that was me on the Sam Donaldson show, and that's Jeff Morrell. Television was sort of invented in 1923. America has entered the modern age. The economy is booming. The jazz age is in full swing. Louis Armstrong, Chicago, and Harlem. Social mores were looser than ever, and the flappers. And the nation was celebrating new dances, new gadgets like radio, even cars, and they had new heroes. In the 1920s, the United States and a lot of the world was perplexing. Many Americans still believed in Victorian values of modesty and hard work and respect for tradition and status and place, and others defiantly broke from convention in their work, in their personal lives, in their actions, and in their words, the flappers. Most Americans searched for a compromise between the world that they knew and the world that they were coming to know. They were not yet ready to fully disengage from the farm. They liked it back there. A lot of cities had electricity. The rural countries didn't have electricity. In fact, I did a talk at Central Michigan University in 1999, April 1999. It was in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. And I was brought in there by a guy by the name of Walter Schneider. And Walter Schneider was in his 60s at the time, so now I guess he'd be close to 90. And he told me that when he grew up in western Michigan, southwestern Michigan, again, he'd be born in the 1930s, he did not see indoor plumbing until he got to college in the 1950s. So that's the world that the city slickers have. Well, they got indoor plumbing, they got electricity, street lights, and then you still have the farms, which is, they're still clinging to the old life. Oh, there were petting parties. I don't know if you've ever heard of what a petting party was. Nobody? Well, that's when, how do I put this delicately? Make out? You know, that's when couples just made out in places in public, and they were called petting parties, particularly in college. The popular image of the 1920s is one of a decade of prosperity, riotous living, bootleggers, gangsters, flappers, hot jazz, flagpole sitters, marathon dancers, and that's what you read in things like The Great Gatsby, right? That's what you read about. But it was more than just that back in those days. It was a decade of deep cultural conflict, pitting a more cosmopolitan, modernist, urban culture against a more provincial, traditionalist, rural culture. Well, there's Adonis. That was his nickname in high school, Adonis, Warren G. Harding. Tall guy, athletic guy, and doesn't he look like a president? He looks like a president. Yeah. That's what got him elected in 1920. He looked like a president. You know, he dressed for success, and people thought he was successful. Literally, that's what he was. On August 2nd, the United States President Warren G. Harding died of a stroke, heart attack, nobody knows, there's no autopsy, in San Francisco, at St. Regis Hotel, at the age of 57. That was the conclusion. That was it. Life is over. But the First Lady of the United States, Florence Harding, would not allow an autopsy of her husband. So it's only a guess that he died of a stroke or a heart attack, or maybe he was poisoned. That was one of the conspiracy theories, that he was poisoned. Warren G. Harding, an Ohio Republican. He was the 29th President of the United States between March 4th, 1921 and August 2nd, 1923. He had the most scandals of any president, but didn't come out while he was president except for the Teapot Dome scandal, which was emerging when he died. He embraced technology. He was on radio. He gave a radio address in 1921, reached out to Riverhead, Long Island, and around the world. He was sensitive to the plights of minorities. He called for equal rights for African Americans, which was amazing in 1921, and women, but only to a certain extent. Harding was a successful newspaper publisher who served in the Ohio legislature and the United States Senate. 1920, he won the general election in a landslide, promising to return to normalcy, whatever that was. Nobody ever could define what returning to normalcy was. But after America entered World War I on August 6, 1917, and the war ended on November 11, 1918, 1919 was tumultuous. You had the Red Scare, you had the Red Riots, you had the anarchists running all over the place, you had the Palmer raids, you had Prohibition that passed the Senate, you had women's rights to vote that passed the Senate, you had the Bolsheviks in Russia. A lot of things were going on, and Wilson had a stroke and was incapacitated. So maybe when he talked about the return to normalcy, maybe he wanted to set the clock back to maybe 1911. And here is the candidate, Warren G. Harding, and he was a newspaper guy. He knew how to lay out a newspaper. He entered politics in 1899. He won a state Senate seat in the Ohio legislature, served 2 terms. he began to advance in Republican circles and Ohio politics. In 1903, became the lieutenant governor. He served in that capacity for 2 years, then went back to the newspaper business. In 1910, he decided he's going to run for the governor of Ohio, but he lost. Undaunted by that loss and encouraged by his cronies, his poker-playing, cigar-smoking, drinking buddies, which is important in this, he decides, well, you know what, I'm going to try to win a seat in the U.S. Senate, and he does, and he becomes Ohio's first senator ever to be elected by a direct vote of citizens. Before that, you used to vote for legislators in the state houses, and they would select the senator. Well, this is the first time, 1914, where somebody is directly elected senator. Took office in 1915, 1916. He received the honor of being chosen to deliver the keynote address as at the Republican National Convention in Chicago. Soon his supporters began to urge him to make a run for the presidency. And he does in 1920, and that's in front of his house. Harding's boyhood hometown band, Marion, Ohio. He conducted a front porch campaign. World War I had just ended on November 11th, 1918. And okay.
Sorry.
No problem. America did have some issues. Returning veterans had trouble finding work. Farmers were in financial trouble. Inflation and the price of goods, they're high. Many peace treaties to end the war had not yet been settled. Many voters blamed the outgoing President Woodrow Wilson for a number of these problems. Wilson was a Democrat. Does he look like a president, yes or no?
Yes.
He looks like a president. That's why people voted for him, because he looked the part. And not only that, he also had celebrity around him, like Al Jolson in 1920. In Ohio, Harry Doherty began to promote Harding for the 1920 Republican nomination because he later explained he looked like a president. That was his only qualification. He looked like a president. His record in the Senate was thin, and he was a womanizer, and he smoked cigars and played poker with his buddies and drank. He had no record. He didn't show up most of the time for votes. But the 1920 conventions take place, and there again, look at him in the middle. Does he look like a president? With all the issues as a backdrop, the Republican Party met in Chicago that summer of 1920 to choose their presidential candidate. Several candidates, including Warren Harding, were being considered for the nomination. But through several ballots, none were receiving enough votes to become the party's nominee. Then in the early morning hours of June 12th, on the 10th ballot, Harding finally gains enough support to win the nomination. The Massachusetts governor, Calvin Coolidge, was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. Later that summer, the Democrats, meeting in San Francisco for their convention, chose Ohio Governor James Cox as their presidential candidate and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as their vice presidential candidate. This right before he was hit with polio. And there are pictures of Roosevelt and Cox walking together. The last pictures of Roosevelt being able to walk. Cox, like Harding, was a newspaperman in Ohio and owned the Dayton Daily News. After the nomination process was completed, Senator Harding returned to Marion, where he decided to conduct an almost entire 3-month campaign from the front porch at his home on Mount Vernon Avenue in Marion. And they told him to shut up. Don't say anything. Just here, this is what you should say. And don't say anything else. Just, look, we know you're a moron. Don't let them know you're a moron. And that was basically it. His choice to campaign in this style was not a new concept. His campaign was actually the fourth front porch campaign, and the other campaigns were Ohio candidates who became president: Benjamin Harrison, James Garfield, William McKinley. Garfield actually died after an assassin's bullet hit him because his doctor's hands weren't clean, and they reached in and looked for the bullet, and he eventually would die, not of the bullet wound, but the infection. It's an interesting story about the assassin, and on one day I should do that talk. I got to put it together. Return to normalcy works. Harding, you're the man for us. Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, words and music by Al Jolson. Who is the biggest star of the time? Al Jolson. You ain't seen nothing yet. Al Jolson, you know, started out as a comedian, part of a brother team, a comic act, and they split up, and he went to Broadway, and of course the rest is history. Of course, Jolson was maybe the biggest star of the 1920s. During the campaign, delegations of citizens came from all across the country to hear Harding speak on important topics of the day, as long as they were handed to him. In addition, many groups came to hear him speak: Civil War veterans, women's groups, Native Americans, African American delegations, Broadway stars of the day. Al Jolson wrote and performed Harding, You're the Man for Us. About 600,000 people came to Marion that summer for Harding's campaign. By contrast, Governor Cox conducted more of a modern campaign by today's standards, crisscrossing the nation over a 2-month period, speaking to as many people as possible. His running mate, Franklin Roosevelt, also traveled the country giving speeches, but Harding won handily. He got 60% of the vote, and America was ready to, whatever normalcy was, they were ready to return to normalcy. He looked like a president. He wasn't a deep thinker, wasn't a decisive president. Harding saw the role of president as largely ceremonial. Kind of took up his time, or took away time from women, booze, cigar smoking, and poker. He saw himself neither as a caretaker nor a leader. He avoided issues whenever possible, but he did bring up some issues. He frequently confided to friends that the job was beyond him. He made some really bad choices in his cabinet, but he made some good choices as well. Harding's legacy, Mellon is there. He was the Secretary of the Treasury, and there are others, some good guys, some really, really, really bad guys. Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes was one of the ablest of his choices. Andrew Mellon, the fabulously wealthy Pittsburgh financier, turned out to be a very powerful Secretary of the Treasury. Mellon would cut taxes on the rich. He's the first guy to do it. And 100 years later, they're still talking about supply side, which he was the guy who came up with it. Cut taxes on the rich, and he would run the economy. He was the first supply side tax cutter. That picture that you saw with me and Jack Kemp was an heir to the Mellon legacy. The engineer, Herbert Hoover, who is probably the most able person in his cabinet, and as history would show, going into his presidency in 1929, he was extremely qualified to be president, except he didn't speak well, but he did a lot of things well. Herbert Hoover, who had earned an international reputation for his work in feeding starving of millions of Western Europeans after World War I, transformed the Department of Commerce into an efficient and effective support agency for U.S. business at home and abroad. Harding surrounded himself, though, with the guys who were known as the Ohio Gang. And the Ohio Gang, well, they're the ones who got him in trouble. Many of them were later charged with defrauding the government. A few of them went to jail. Harding clearly knew of his limitations and their limitations, but he liked to play poker with them. He liked to drink whiskey with them. This is prohibition. And Warren G. Harding is the #1 law enforcement agent in the United States. To drink liquor was not illegal. You could drink liquor. You just couldn't get it. That was the illegal part of it all. But if you got it, go ahead and drink. But if it was bootlegged and they caught you, well, that's another story. So, but he did like to drink whiskey, he liked to smoke, liked to tell jokes, liked to play golf, and he was a party boy. He was a playboy. He liked to stay up late. He was going to have a good old time. Harding was a womanizer. He had an illegitimate daughter with Nan Britton in 1919. That was covered up. Harding secretly made child support payments hand-delivered by the Secret Service for the daughter he never met. He died, of course, in 1923. And Prohibition, not a problem for our guy. Not a problem for our guy at all. Warren Harding, hey, come on, let's have a drink at the White House. But aren't you the #1 law? Well, you know, don't worry about it. I'll take care of that. Yeah, drinking was not a problem for Warren G. Harding. His lifestyle in the White House was fairly unconventional compared to his predecessor. Upstairs at the White House in the yellow Oval Room, Harding allowed bootleg whiskey to be served to guests during after-dinner parties at a time when the president was supposed to enforce prohibition. By the way, Warren G. Harding had a best friend by the name of Jerry. They never parted. When Warren died, so did Jerry. And Jerry got him into some trouble. How do I explain perfectly how Jerry was? Well, he was a womanizer. And his best friend was somebody down here named Jerry. And that's Carrie Fulton Phillips, a mistress. He tried to blackmail him. His milquetoast persona belied his driving libido. It's a good thing I'm not a woman, he once told the press. I would always be pregnant. I can't say no. Or was it Jerry who couldn't say no? He began an extramarital romance with Carrie Fulton Phillips in 1905 when he was the Ohio Lieutenant Governor, and it continued after his 1914 Senate election. Although he refused to divorce his wife, he thought about it in one of the letters, she suffered from chronic kidney issues. Harding assured his mistress it was a loveless marriage. Until he decided, maybe I should marry this woman. By the way, one of his best friends was Phillips' husband. When the Phillips had a child who died, Mr. Phillips went crazy. He went to an asylum. And Warren came over to comfort Carrie, and I guess Jerry took over after that. So anyway, as Europe moved closer to the brink of war, Phillips returned to the United States from Europe. Her passion for Germany, she was a Kaiser fan. She loved Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser fan. Upon returning to Marion, Ohio, Phillips' affair with Harding reignited. Phillips, though, reportedly threatened to expose the affair if Harding voted in favor of war with Germany. So she's gonna blackmail him because she's a Kaiser fan. His friend named Jerry. So here's the Republican Party, and they got to figure out what they're going to do with not only Nan Britton and the daughter, but what are they going to do with Harding and Jerry and Carrie Phillips. In the 1920 Republican nomination, immediately following his acceptance of the Republican nomination, Harding disclosed his affair with Phillips to the Republican Party officials, also disclosing that Phillips was in possession of hundreds of love letters he had written to her, many on U.S. Senate stationery. He may have conceived his illegitimate daughter in a U.S. Senate room. That's one of the rumors. Reportedly wary of the scandal involving an affair as well as Phillips' support of the German government, the Republican Party urged Mr. and Mrs. Phillips to go travel abroad. In fact, we're going to send you on a slow boat to Japan and maybe even China during the election cycle. Back in those days, as somebody who's worked on cruise ships, you can't go back and forth to the States now or wherever you live. back in those days, it was kind of difficult to get messages back and forth. So go take this trip. See you later. Enjoy yourself. Here's $20,000. You want more? Here's $25,000. And we'll see you later. Mrs. Phillips responded by dictating terms under which she would consider the party's wishes. In return for Phillips' silence on the matter, the Republican Party offered to pave the way for an extended tour of Asia and Pacific Islands, as well as an annual stipend to Phillips for the remainder of her life. The Republican National Committee paid Phillips $5,000 a month to stay silent about her affair with the president. $5,000 a month. He still looks like a president, doesn't he? Harding signed the revised version of the Budget and Account Act of 1921, which allowed the president to present a unified budget for the first time, rather than having each cabinet secretary submit a budget to Congress, which also created the General Accounting Office to audit government expenditures, and of course the GAO is around today. He also supported bills assisting farm cooperatives in the liberalization of farm credit to help the farmers. He was tolerant on civil liberties, honestly criticizing the unfair treatment of African Americans. He once lectured a segregated crowd of 30,000 people at the University of Alabama in Birmingham in 1921 on the virtues of racial equality and the evils of segregation. It wasn't all that bad. He just wanted to have a good time. This is Eugene V. Debs. Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, had him arrested. Wilson took away, trampled the Constitution during World War I, to the point where if you criticize the military, you can face up to 10 years in jail. He was once the socialist candidate for president. In fact, in 1920, he did run for president from jail. From jail. Wilson put him in jail, and he deported people and trampled all over the Constitution. Heading back from granting a general amnesty to hundreds of Americans jailed for nonviolent anti-war protests during the Wilson years, he instructed the Justice Department to review each arrest on a case-by-case basis. The guy he pardoned, Eugene V. Debs. There is a radio station in New York, or used to be a radio station in New York, WEVD. The call letters of that station, WEVD, EVD, stood for Eugene V. Debs. Debs was noted for his speaking skills. He had a speech denouncing American participation in World War I that led to his second arrest in 1918. He was convicted under the Sedition Act of 1918, sentenced to 10 years in prison. Warren G. Harding commuted his sentence December 25th, 1921. Debs ran for president on the socialist ticket, received about 1 million votes, campaigned from jail. Harding tells, though, the Statue of Liberty immigrants to go away. Harding supported the Johnson Immigration Quota Act of 1921, which stipulated that the annual immigration of a given nationality could not exceed 3% of the number of immigrants that were residing in the nation in 1910. This quota made it more difficult for immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. And you can figure out who those are. You can figure out in 1 second who those are. Whose numbers had been smaller in 1910 to enter the country. Harding was determined, actually, to make the federal government serve U.S. business interests. He supported the efforts by Andrew Mellon to push through substantial tax cuts for the rich and for corporations. And the voyage of understanding Trek. Warren G. Harding is about ready to start his 1924 presidential re-election campaign, and that would be the beginning of the end. He's on this train, and he's going out west. Not only is he going out west, he's also going up to Alaska. On June 20th, Harding starts a transcontinental tour, which is called the Voyage of Understanding. He gives addresses in St. Louis, in Kansas City, in Hutchinson, Kansas, Denver, Salt Lake City, Idaho Falls, Helena, and Meacham, Oregon. with many informal comments and stops along the way. He explores national parks, drives a train locomotive, takes part in an Oregon Trail pageant. He's getting ready for re-election. On July 5th, Harding and his companions arrived in Tacoma, Washington, boarded the USS Henderson on a voyage to Alaska. During his time in Alaska, he visited Mount McKinley National Park, which is now the University of, which is now houses the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And he also attended the completion of the Alaska Railroad in Nenana, where he drove the final spike to finish it. As he concluded the Alaska portion of his tour in late July, Harding began to complain of cramps, indigestion, fever, and a shortness of breath. And gets to Seattle eventually. I was in Seattle in November. That's what Seattle looked like last November. And my daughter lives down the steps from there with my granddaughter there. We're going back out there in April. Upon returning to the U.S. on July 7th, Harding participated in a series of events in Seattle. After reviewing the naval fleet in the harbor and riding in a parade downtown, he addressed a crowd of 30,000 Boy Scouts at a jamboree in Woodland Park, then 25,000 people at the University of Washington's Husky Stadium. That evening, in what would be his last official public event, he addressed the Seattle Press Club. By the end of the evening, he was near collapse. He went to bed early. And the decision was made, California, here I come, get them to San Francisco as quickly as you can. And that is San Francisco, and behind that's the Bay Area Bridge leading to Oakland. On July 28th, all the tour stops scheduled between Seattle and San Francisco canceled. The presidential entourage proceeded directly there. Gets into San Francisco on the morning of July 29th. He felt well enough that he wanted to walk from the train to the car. Shortly after arriving at the Palace Hotel, he suffered a relapse. Upon examining him, doctors found that not only was Harding's heart causing problems, he had a case of pneumonia. All public engagements were canceled. He was treated with caffeine. That's good for a heart condition, give him caffeine, right? And digitalis. He seemed to improve. Reports that were released on July 31st that what his speech was going to be received a favorable response, but he never gave it. Lifted his spirits, and by the afternoon, August 2nd, doctors allowed him to sit up in bed. That evening, about 7:30 at night, while Florence Harding was reading a flattering article to the president from the Saturday Evening Post, titled "A Calm Review of a Calm Man." He's not a calm man, he's a party boy. He began twisting convulsively, collapsed. Doctors gave him stimulants. Yeah, okay. But they were unable to revive him. Harding was dead. Meanwhile, Calvin Coolidge is somewhere in Vermont, the vice president. He's on his parents' farm. No telephones. No direct way of getting in touch with him. Like, you can't say, hey, the president's dead. He's sleeping. He gets a knock on the door. He's got to dress the part because he's told Harding's dead. Calvin Coolidge returned to Plymouth, Vermont to call on his family on August 2nd. He was the vice president. He was awakened with the news of President Harding's sudden death in San Francisco. In a ceremony held around 2:47 in the morning on August 3rd, in the sitting room, Coolidge's father, John Calvin Coolidge Sr., a notary public and justice of the peace, swore him in as President of the United States. Witnessing the event, his wife Grace, U.S. Representative Porter H. Dale, L.L. Lane of the Railway Mail Association, and Coolidge's chauffeur and stenographer. Then he went back to sleep. He just became President of the United States. Tired. Bye. Well, he supported a lot of the same causes as Harding. He worked to eradicate the corruption of the Harding administration, which is leaking through. Nothing he could do about Nan Britton's daughter, but but he could cut off, I guess, if he wanted to, tell the National Republican Committee, don't send Phillips any more money. He told the journalist, Allen White, late in his presidency, this is Harding telling William Allen White late in his presidency, I have no trouble with my enemies, but my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at night. You know, the guys he drank with, the guys he played cards with, the guys he smoked with, those are the guys who worried him. The only scandal that was openly discovered during Harding's lifetime was with the Veterans Bureau. Well, that's a guy by the name of Charles Forbes. He was part of the Ohio gang, although he didn't come from Ohio. He was the director of the Veterans Bureau, today the Veterans Administration. And he discarded the needs of wounded World War I veterans to procure his own wealth. After his appointment, Forbes convinced Harding to issue executive orders that gave him control over veterans' hospitals and their construction and their supplies. To limit corruption in the Veterans Bureau, Harding insisted that all government contracts be by public notice. But Forbes said, nah, I don't have to do that. I'll tell my friends what's going on, and I want to make sure your bids succeed because I'm getting something out of it. Forbes was accused of accepting kickbacks from contractors building veterans hospitals and illegally selling surplus medical supplies. Forbes' main task at the Veterans Bureau, having a $500 million yearly budget, was to ensure that new hospitals were built around the country to help the wounded 300,000 World War I vets. Forbes defrauded the government of an estimated $225 million by increasing construction costs from $3,000 to $4,000 a hospital bed. And guess where that money went? Right into his pocket. As of January, Harding did know of Forbes' deeds. When Forbes returned to the U.S. after an overseas trip, he visited Harding at the White House in the Red Room. During the meeting, Warren G. Harding wasn't calm. He was a guy, he's a party guy. But you know what? He knew how to use his fists too. He grabbed Forbes by the throat, shook him vigorously, and exclaimed, "You double-crossing bastard." Forbes resigned on February 15. Harding was a very, very popular president, extremely popular, and more than likely would have won the 1924 elections as long as the daughter wasn't known about and Phillips got her money and he could control Forbes and Albert Fell and Doherty and a whole bunch of others. His body returned to Washington on August 7th following a cross-country train trip. He was laid out in the East Room of the White House, then in Congress, then sent to Marion, Ohio for his funeral on August 10th. An estimated 9 million people turned out to watch his train go by as it went to Washington. There were rumors that Harding was poisoned by his wife. Those rumors would end up in a book in 1930, but there was really nothing to it. The problem was, Florence Harding said no autopsy. No autopsy at all. So, there was no autopsy. There were rumors that, like I said, poisoned by his wife. Coolidge had to clean up the scandals from the Harding administration. Harding knew of the scandals and did nothing. And he might not have been involved in any of the corruption. So it's cleanup time for Calvin Coolidge. In the waning days of the Harding administration, several scandals had begun to emerge into public view. Coolidge was not implicated in any of the corrupt dealings because he didn't play poker, he didn't smoke cigars, he didn't drink with the boys. He was faced with the fallout of the scandals in the early days of his presidency. And that is Albert Fall, and that is Harry Sinclair, Teapot Dome scandal. Harding appointed Senator Albert Fall from New Mexico as Secretary of the Interior in 1921. That's a problem. Fall was a politically powerful senator, rancher, lawyer, miner who liked Harding, enjoyed the game of poker, liked to play poker and had that whiskey there even though it was illegal. Fall soon convinced Harding to transfer oversight of the petroleum reserves from the Navy to his Interior Department. Come on, Warren, you can do it for me. Yeah, come on. You know, I might let you win a game or a hand or two of poker. In 1922, there was no competitive bidding or any public announcement on the land. Fall leased exclusive drilling rights to the entire Teapot Dome site in Wyoming to the Mammoth Oil Company, owned by longtime friend Harry Sinclair of Sinclair Gas. Fall also leased 2 reserves in California to the Pan American Petroleum Company, owned by Edward Doherty, another friend of Fall's. By April 1922, rumors of a shady deal began swirling after local Wyoming oilmen noticed tanks with the Sinclair logo. They were so brazen. The tanks, they had the logo on it. Trucks with the logo on it, hauling oil field equipment up to Teapot Dome. The Wall Street Journal broke the news about the deal April 14, 1922, in an article. The Senate would start an investigation. So Calvin Coolidge has to clean up all of this mess. Hey, he's with the world's greatest entertainer there, Al Jolson. A bipartisan Senate investigation led by Thomas J. Walsh and Robert La Follette began just weeks into the Calvin Coolidge presidency. As the investigation uncovered further misconduct, Coolidge appointed Alty Pomerini and Owen Roberts as special prosecutors, but he remained personally unconvinced as to the guilt of Harding's appointees. Boy, was he in for a shock. Harding's policies were okay with Cal. Coolidge addressed Congress when it reconvened on December 6th, expressing support for many of Harding's policies, including Harding's formal budgeting process and enforcement of immigration restrictions, and even child labor. Child labor is coming back into the news in the last few years. Places like Arkansas. Child labor. Shoeshine box. Shoeshine boy. By 1920, every state in the Union had such child labor laws, yet child labor persisted. According to the 1920 census, about 1 million children aged between 10 and 15 were working in 1920. Out of a total population of 12 million kids in that age range. About half worked on the family farms. The rest worked everywhere else, factories, trained as apprentices, served as messengers. Some children began working at the age of 5. A constitutional amendment proposed on December 3rd was to give power to Congress, or give Congress the power to regulate child labor. Over there, send the word out, the boys are coming, the Yanks are coming, right? It won't be over until it's over there. It's like George M. Cohan, right? The First World War, subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order and ensure that the slaughter of the First World War would never be repeated. And there's Woodrow Wilson, George Clemenceau, Orlando from Italy, and David Lloyd George from England. They were the big four, and they carve up Europe. The war ends on November 11th, 1918. 4 years of fighting, millions of soldiers died, civilians died. Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, created the League of Nations, international body that was intended to promote peace and prevent war. America never joined the League of Nations for various reasons, including isolation. The treaty was an uneasy compromise between the victorious allies, Britain, America, France, and Italy, but they decided to go their own way. Germany was forced to surrender territory, disarm, and pay for the war's damage, and this was criticized as overly indictive by many in Britain and America, but France wanted to shove it right down Germany's throat. And there was outrage and bitterness in Germany. The irony would be that Germany eventually would come out of this pretty good. By creating Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Baltic states, the treaty put a buffer between Germany and one of its traditional rivals, Russia. Fighting among the new states weakened them, and the geography of their new borders made it difficult to defend. Germany emerged from the war with small, weak states on its eastern border. 1923, World War I officially comes to the very end, the Treaty of Lausanne. The Treaty of Versailles signed in June 1919, but the formal peace process doesn't end until July 24th and 23, with the Treaty of Lausanne signed in Switzerland by France, Britain, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, and the new Republic of Turkey. So why did Hitler hate Jews? Why did he hate Jews? Well, he believed a lie. During the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, Adolf Hitler was a soldier in the German army. At the end of the war, he and many other German soldiers like him couldn't believe that they had lost. Soldiers like Rudolf Hess, soldiers like Hermann Göring. The German army command spread the myth, the big lie. Army didn't lose on the battlefield, although they did. They had been betrayed. They'd been betrayed. Well, who betrayed them? Stab in the back. That's what it was called. Hitler bought into the myth, the big lie. Jews and communists. They betrayed the country. They brought a left-wing government to power and who wanted to throw in the towel. 1919, Hitler penned a letter to a colleague known as the Gremlich letter. Just spoke about how horrible the Jews were. Nazi Party members in 1922. By blaming the Jews for the defeat, Hitler created a stereotypical enemy. According to the Austrian citizen, he was Austrian citizen, Hitler expelling the Jews was the solution to all problems in Germany. And this is the beginning of Nazism. It's Munich, Germany. It's February 20th, 1920. And Hitler delivers the Nazi Party platform speech to a large crowd in Munich. And that is, historians agree, the beginning of the Nazi era. The German Workers' Party had already existed. Hitler was a great orator, laid out a 25-point platform. His central idea strengthened German citizenship by excluding and controlling Jewish people and others deemed to be non-German. Hitler wasn't a German. He was an Austrian. So according to the Hitler doctrine, Hitler would have been thrown out of Germany. Very young, well, he wasn't that young, he was about 32 years old at the time, Adolf Hitler. Combining his considerable oratory capabilities with an unusual ability to read an audience mood, both in individuals and large groups, Hitler established himself as the absolute Führer, or leader of the NSDAP by 1921. This guy was a nobody, and all of a sudden, people glomming around him. Using contacts made in his former military circles, especially with the well-known Air Force ace Hermann Göring and former Army Captain Ernest Röhm, Hitler grew the party membership to 55,000, which isn't much, within 2 years. The Weimar Republic in hyperinflation, and this is basically Germany's problem. The money is worthless. Here's a guy just putting the money up on the wall. It's not worth anything. Throughout Germany, the first 4 years of the Weimar Republic were marred by economic woes, trauma at the loss of World War I, humiliation at what many considered to be the excessively harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty. In this climate of national instability, both left and right-wing political movements attempted and failed to overthrow the fledgling German democracy. German money worth nothing. Globally, nations were more concerned with receiving their reparation payments from Germany than anything else that was happening in the state. That's worthless. That is absolutely worthless money. Don't be stupid, be a smarty, come and join the Nazi Party. Mel Brooks, 1968. The Nazi Party was a small, right-wing extremist group. The majority of people who followed Hitler had joined the Nazi Party with the hope that it would take action against the Democratic Republic. Benito Mussolini's successful March on Rome, which brought the fascists to power in Italy in October 1922, inspired Hitler. He planned to seize control of the national government with a parallel march on Berlin. At the same time, members of the Bavarian state government were agitating, looking for a change. The state government protested Berlin's decision to halt passive resistance against the Franco-Belgian troops occupying the Rhineland and the Ruhr. As a result, it declared a state of emergency. It put the President Gustav Ritter van Kahr in charge as the General State Commissar, together with his associates, Armed Forces General Otto von Lossow and State Police Chief Hans Ritter von Sesser. And this would lead to Hitler trying to overthrow the government in Munich in November of 1923. Using justification, chaos created by the occupation of the Ruhr, the inflationary spiral, and communist agitation in central Germany, Hitler pushed his reluctant conservative partners into agreeing to a march on Berlin to overthrow the Weimar Republic. The planners of the overthrow had crashed a rally organized by Gustav Ritter van Kahr and held the Bavarian leaders hostage through the night of November 8th, 9th, while they debated how to proceed. On November 9th, Hitler and his followers confronted an armed police detachment. After a few shots, the police opened fire, a volley that effectively suppressed the beer hall push. After the failed push, German authorities banned the Nazi Party and its formations, arrested many of the ringleaders, including Hitler, on charges of high treason. That's Turkey. I went to lunch. When I went to the restaurant, they insisted that I had to eat like somebody from the 7th century. So, I ate like somebody from the 7th century. The Turkish Republic was founded from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire by national independence hero Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and was established on October 29th. Atatürk established a Western-facing secular republic, ushering in radical reforms that abolished the caliphate, replaced the Arabic script with the Roman alphabet, gave women the vote, and adopted European laws and codes. The lost girls, the ones that danced on tabletops at speakeasies, flappers. Unlike their mothers and grandmothers, flappers tended to go to high school and even college, and they devoured new books featuring confident, fun-loving adolescent heroines who hiked and camped and solved mysteries. Flappers biked, played golf, played tennis. They strove to emulate the flat-chested and hipless physiques of adolescent boys whose freedom and lack of domestic responsibilities they envied. They were a great source of concern to their parents, their grandparents, older sisters, educators, physicians, clergymen, who feared that sports and higher education would be ruinous. But there they are. They're doing the Charleston, and they're having a good old time. Any of your relatives do the Charleston?
My sisters did.
Your sisters did.
My older sisters.
Your older sisters. Were they flappers? They were flaps, so they must have driven your mother crazy. Yeah, that laugh tells me all I need to know. A flapper cut her hair short into what was known as the bob. She wore shorter dresses, rouged her knees, actually painted their knees, as well as her cheeks. She drank alcohol, she smoked cigarettes, dated multiple men before marriage. There was increased access to birth control, such as the diaphragm. And women experimented with other guys before they got married. They went to speakeasies, which was a place where they could drink alcohol provided by gangsters. The post-war prosperity expressed itself in many ways. One of the first, the availability of credit. Department stores opened as the middle class could now use credit to obtain upper-class luxuries, leading to the birth of consumerism. With it came the flapper dress, mass-produced for public consumption. And that's the hairstyle of the day. You have curly hair, you have straight hair. Well, that was the hairstyle, the bobbed hair. New cosmetic companies sold cold creams to eradicate wrinkles. Magazines advertised flappers, hairstyles, and clothing, plus extreme diets and dubious claims for the slimming effects of cigarettes and chewing gum. It sounds like today. Some women resorted to a new vogue in cosmetic surgery, kicking off an era of damaging self-scrutiny, obsession with weight, youthfulness, and body image. And they did the Charleston. And the Charleston was scandalous. Absolutely scandalous. Why? It was an old African dance. The Charleston is one of the most popular dances and songs of all time. Inspired by the song of the same name, the dance was invented in 1923. The dance was always considered risque and caused problems among the older generation. The Charleston became a pop culture phenomenon starting on October 19th, thanks to the song, The Charleston, which was composed by James P. Johnson from the Broadway show Running Wild. The dance was scandalous. Men and women who shed their stuffy etiquette of their parents' generation just wanted to flap their arms, kick up their heels, and let loose, like they are doing the Charleston. The Charleston actually wasn't invented in October. It was based on a dance popularized by the black community called Jumbo, first in Africa in the mid-19th century and then goes to South Carolina. Running Wild was an all-black show, which was totally unusual on Broadway, written by Cecil Mack, who wrote the music and lyrics. F.E. Miller wrote the book. The musical opened on October 29th. Speakeasies. As long as you knew to say the secret, no, that's a different Marksburg. As long as you knew the password, you could get in, and even Harpo could get in. So he knew what the password was. Swordfish. Come on in. When Prohibition took effect on January 17, 1920, many thousands of formerly legal saloons across the country, catering to men only, closed down. People wanted to drink, had to buy from druggists who had alcohol for medicinal purposes, clergymen for religious reasons, or illegal settlers or saloons known as bootleggers. An option was to enter private, unlicensed bar rooms, named speakeasies. You had to speak low to get in. And, then you could get in, join the party. Prohibition was difficult to enforce. The demand for alcohol was outweighing sobriety. People found clever ways to evade Prohibition agents. They carried hip flasks, hollowed canes, false books, that kind of stuff. And the feds couldn't keep up with them. In general, Prohibition was enforced much more strongly in areas where the population was sympathetic to the legislation, rural areas, small towns, as opposed to, say, New York City, which had 25, 30,000 speakeasies. A speakeasy could be your apartment with your bathtub filled with gin, or a place like this. There were also many unintended consequences of Prohibition. Some cash-strapped restaurants shuttered their doors so they could no longer make a profit from liquor sales. Thousands of people died each year from drinking cheap moonshine tainted with toxins. And revenue shrank for many states that had previously relied on liquor taxes to fund roads, schools, and other public benefits. New York votes to end Prohibition. We don't want it here anymore. Get out. We don't want it. May 4th, New York State's legislature repealed the Mullen-Gage Act, which had incorporated the provisions of Prohibition into state law. Legally repealing the act meant little. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution still outlawed the sale or possession of liquor. Of course, that didn't stop New Yorkers from drinking alcohol. And Al Capone, assisted by longtime Cook County racketeer Edward Vogel, establishes his headquarters in the Chicago suburb of Cicero, Illinois. Hunchback of Notre Dame, big moving. It was part of Universal's Super Jewel, or was Universal's Super Jewel of the 1923 film season. It's the most successful silent film ever. The film, most notable for the grand sets that recall 15th century Paris, as well as Lon Chaney's performance in spectacular makeup as the tortured bell ringer of Notre Dame. The film elevated Chaney to full star status in Hollywood and set the standard for future Hollywood horror movies. That is the Hollywood sign. Except the original Hollywood sign didn't just say Hollywood. The Hollywood sign was officially dedicated on July 13th over the Hollywood Hills on Mount Lee in Los Angeles, originally erected as Hollyland, as an advertisement to get real estate investors involved. That's the modern radio. That's the modern radio. Magnavox invented the world's first single dial radio. The radio TRF-5 came with the R3 speaker. The set used two RF and two audio amplifier type A tubes plus one detector, two type D, A and B batteries, and covered the AM broadcast band. Now if you remember that, you could operate a radio. About 1% of the households owned at least one radio receiver. On December 6th, President Calvin Coolidge's State of the Union was broadcast. Nobody knows how many people actually listened to it. And buying a radio was really, really expensive. And here's an ad saying, hey, come on in and buy a radio. The little gem crystal cost $10.45, $187 today. Came with a radio and headphones and an aerial wire. The General Electric crystal set was $5.95, $106 today, but by the time you bought headphones and the antenna wire, the price was probably the same. If you had a lot of money, you could get a Radio Corporation of America, RCA, complete 3-tube radio lab, complete with batteries, tubes, antenna, and other tubes for $142.50, which would be $2,556 today. Oh, the average American in those days making $2,200 a year or $40,000 a year today. And this guy is working, comes up with an iconoscope, which would lead to television eventually. The Russian-born American Vladimir Zworykin invented the iconoscope. Zworykin worked at the Westinghouse Electronic Company at the time in Pittsburgh when he filed the patent for the iconoscope. According to the patent filed on December 29th, Zworykin planned for the device to be part of a completely electronic television system. And other technological debuts included neon lights. Jacob Schick invented the first electric shaver. By the way, I think I need a shave. Clarence Birdseye invented frozen foods. Sound on film technology is invented. Firestone unveiled the first production balloon tire. Garrett Morgan patented the first traffic light with a warning light. Insulin was mass produced and readily available for the treatment of diabetes, and neon lights brought to the US from Paris. Claude Leon began selling them in Los Angeles. Well, he was popular. Look at all those people at the casket of Warren G. Harding. The Teapot Dome scandal also consumed much of the early days of the administration of Calvin Coolidge, the vice president succeeding Harding. In 1929, Albert Fell, the Secretary of the Interior, who was bribed by Harry Sinclair for control of the Teapot Dome federal oil reserves in Wyoming, was the first U.S. cabinet member ever to be convicted. Served 2 years in prison. On January 29, 2015, the Department of Energy sold the Teapot Dome oil field for $45 million to New York-based Stranded Oil Reserve Corporation. The illegitimate daughter, Nan Britton, and her daughter. Scandals involving Warren G. Harding kept coming after his death, including the claims he had fathered the illegitimate daughter in the White House of his alleged mistress, Nan Britton. In 1927, Nan Britton Book, the president's daughter, was published, in which she wrote that her daughter's father was indeed Warren G. Harding. 2015 DNA testing confirmed that Elizabeth Ann Bleissing was indeed Warren G. Harding's biological child. Time of the scandal. Senate investigation, 1924, found that the Veterans Bureau Chief Charles Forbes and his associates stole more than $200 million, nearly $2.8 billion today from the Bureau. Following year, he's sentenced to 2 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. He entered Leavenworth Prison in 1926. The leader of the Ohio gang was Harry M. Doherty, longtime political operative who said he looked like a president of Harding, who's the principal manager of Harding's political ascendancy, who was named the Attorney General of the U.S. Other members of the gang included Fall, Will Hayes, the Postmaster General, Charles R. Forbes of the Veterans Bureau, and Jess Smith, an official of the Justice Department. Doherty, the political operative who was appointed Attorney General after engineering Harding's presidential nomination, stood trial twice for conspiracy of selling illegal permits and pardons, never convicted. Nice guy, right? Doherty's private secretary, Jess Smith, committed suicide on May 30th, 1923, the day after Harding informed him of his impending arrest for corruption in a White House meeting. Hayes became the president of the Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, then tried to impose a moral code on the movies. He gave murky testimony to the Senate about Sinclair and the Teapot Dome scandal. Harding has traditionally been ranked as one of the worst American presidents. Harding once said of himself, "I'm not fit for this office and I should never have been here." Harding and Coolidge. Coolidge would run for president in 1924, easily defeated John W. Davis, did not run for re-election in 1928. One of Harding's cabinet members, Herbert Hoover, ran for the presidency in 1928, defeated the New York governor, Al Smith. Hoover would preside over the worst economic downfall in American history, October 29, 1929. He called it the Depression, and it was called Hoover's Depression. Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the governor of Arkansas. Although Congress approved a joint resolution proposing child labor amendments to the Constitution, it was never ratified by the necessary 3/4 of state legislators. In 2023, at least 24 state legislative initiatives, state-level initiatives, some of them successfully enacted to water down or limit legal protection of child workers. Arkansas Governor Huckabee Sanders signed the Youth Hiring Act of 2023, rolling back requirements that the state verify the ages of workers under 16 and providing them with work certificates which allow them to work. Reichstag, Germany, no Nazis. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in 1932. Germany annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia in 1938. Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939, started World War II. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor December 7th, 1941. The war ends in 1945. The Nazi Party has been outlawed in Germany. During the Charleston, Capitol Hill, the flapper lifestyle and look disappeared as the roaring 20s glitz and glamour comes to a crashing end during the Wall Street crash of 1929. Unable to afford the latest trends and lifestyles, the once vibrant flapper women returned to their dropped hemlines and flapper dress disappeared. 1963, Betty Friedan released the book, The Feminine Mystique, which referenced the flappers. The book was the start of the 1960s women's rights movement. Prohibition ended in 1933. Lon Chaney. His roles left an imprint on the horror film genre. His characters marked some of the earliest experiments in body horror on screen, and the surreal yet human monsters live on in visual storytelling. Chaney's best roles were in The Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He broke new ground in the silent era of Hollywood for his exceptionally skilled use of makeup and the ability to contort his body in any manner he chose. He died in 1930. The Hollywood sign was shortened to Hollywood in 1949, and it was restored in 1978 after a renovation. And this is RCA Radiola, the expensive one. Despite his nickname, Silent Cal, Calvin Coolidge was one of the first politicians to fully embrace radio. By the late 1920s, most Americans had a radio. It started out as a hobby industry in the 19-teens, with people talking to each other. In 1920, radio broadcasts started. The golden age of American radio as a creative medium lasted from 1932 to 1955. Most radio stations today are worthless. That's me, and that's me on MSNBC. This guy is now the director of the state lottery in Connecticut. Vladimir Zworykin died on July 29, 1982. And he really became concerned about the direction television had taken. And this is 42 years ago, and its effect on society. He had hoped TV would serve to educate the public and to broadcast cultural events. Dismayed at the trivial and counterproductive materials often featured on TV, Zaworkin later lamented, "I hate what I've done to my child. I would never let my own children watch it. I hate what they've done to my child. I would never let my own children watch it." That's what he thought of television. Any questions or comments? It is your turn to talk.
Thank you very much.
Overwhelmed? That was the basis of your life. If you think of it.
Yeah.
That was the